Hi guys. Each month we share our metrics and data with a company called STR. And today we're fortunate enough to have a few minutes with Matthew Burke, Regional Manager. Is that your title, Matt?
Works well.
Perfect. And that entitles us to have a look at some of the metrics and key data on our competitor set in the economy and mid-scale. Matt, before we get into that, I'm going to ask you the most important question. Who do you follow in the AFL?
I'm a Lions fan, being a Queenslander. So after many years of being a very quiet fan in South Australia, I can be quite a loud fan at the moment. So they just need to kick between the sticks a little bit better than they are at the moment.
I thought Adelaide-based, you're either going to be top of the ladder or bottom of the ladder.
That's right. That's right. Yes.
Mate, what are you seeing out there? Maybe if we can talk about each of the states very quickly, or what are some of the trends we're seeing out in the market?
Yeah, perfect. Well, thanks very much, Brett, for the opportunity, and thank you to everyone out there who's tuning in. And for those in Victoria, I can't say I feel your pain, but I can sympathise with having to be at home, and those of you who may not be at work where you want to be. So really appreciate taking the time to tune in. But I think probably before we get into the state picture, I thought there's sort of four key themes that are really consistent across the nation, and funnily enough, well, it's not really funny, but they're very similar across the world. Wherever you look, that what we're seeing is that regional areas within countries are outperforming their capital city peers, and that regional areas are really seeing the biggest uplifts on Friday and Saturday nights, and then school holiday periods. So not surprising that you see that if people have the opportunity to get out and about, that they are taking the opportunity to have little mini breaks. I think across all capital cities, because there isn't the corporate traveling demand that we previously had, there's not a lot of meetings activity going on. You are very much limited to the various quarantine business that each of the cities have had, and then also in Melbourne, you've got obviously additional kind of government support coming into that market to help with the restrictions and monitoring how they can get the virus count down for that. I think obviously the third thing is that if we went back to June when the country started to open up, Victoria regionally and New South Wales regionally were on a very similar trajectory of increasing occupancies both during the week and on weekends. But when stage 3 restrictions for Melbourne went into force in early July, that significantly saw a deviation, and Victoria essentially dropped away and has flatlined since then, whereas New South Wales regionally has continued on to the pattern I saw earlier. And I think probably the fourth point is using the forward data we're now collecting. So not only the historic data, what we are seeing is that there isn't any substantial change in the trend around the entire country, that corporate demand isn't coming in any great volume yet, and equally there isn't a lot of meetings, and that makes sense because you don't have a lot of air access that's really changed over the last 2 months, and largely to get from capital city to capital city, we need to be on airplanes to do that. So we're very much a trailing indicator to that air access, which is seeing the future, other than the Saturday night peaks of locals, largely be quite limited in the future demand, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's very consistent with what we're seeing. Certainly, you see and hear from the industry almost like the closer you're in the city, the worse off you are, with no international, no events, no festivals, not a great deal, and some of the big groups and brands of the world are sitting at single, maybe double-digit occupancies in the 20s, maybe. So it's unbelievable.
Yeah, I don't think anyone would have foreseen what the industry's had to go through, and very much the average is usually a pretty good indicator that people are close to that. But at this time, there is large disparities between those who might have the quarantine business and then the rest of the market who have either decided to close, and we still have many properties in Melbourne, for example, that haven't reopened since the end of March. That largely there isn't a demand to see for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Or maybe start off in the West. What are you seeing out in WA?
Yeah, so I think they're probably starting in the most optimistic state, really. That even though they've closed themselves off to the rest of Australia from their hard borders, they're continuing to do reasonably well. I mean, everything's relative to occupancy, but in July, for example, they did 49% across the market, and that's, Perth's the strongest capital city market in occupancy on average. And I think, largely that's from a couple of factors. That you've got, the mining and oil and gas kind of business is been deemed essential. So you've seen that continue, and a lot of the FIFO workers who don't live in Western Australia are kind of become pseudo residents of Western Australia because they can't get in and out. So we're seeing lots of blocks in service departments, etc., in that market. But then at the same time, you've got the markets in the north that, nothing's really changed too much, broadly speaking. And then in the south, where, Perth people are taking the weekend away, again, similar to the national trend.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Western Australians starting to spend money in their own state, and it's the only state in ALH that's up year on year. So it's up on last year. So fantastic results over there. And then across to your hometown, South Australia, I see even Regis have announced the 180 room new development in what they call the Boomtown.
Yeah, there's quite a few new hotels, and that's going to be one thing, I think, in the recovery stage, that some cities that, very different to the GFC period where we didn't have a lot of new supply. This time around, some cities are going to have quite a bit, which is going to subdue the occupancy growing back. But yeah, I mean, similar to most other capitals where the Adelaide's not doing too well, but because we've largely got limited restrictions of movement and activities, the regional areas are doing quite well at the moment, and business activities happening in the regions as well. But yeah, I think, pockets like in Port Adelaide and up north are probably doing a little bit better because they've got obviously some of those industries around pharmaceutical and defense that have continued on through that period. So yeah, it's definitely a changing environment in the north of the city.
Yeah, and down to Tasmania.
Yeah, so Tasmania is kind of similar to Western Australia in that they've got, a hard border to the rest of the country, but unfortunately they don't have the same population volume that Western Australia has. So their opportunity to kind of re-energize themselves is limited by, the population that exists there, and that has a limiting effect to that. So again, we're seeing, some peaks in some of the regions on the weekend as people get around for that. And probably Tasmanians are enjoying the peace and quiet from that perspective, because prior to COVID, it was a bustling activity for that. So it is pretty limited in terms of what they're doing. And I think when you look at July's numbers, the state only did 36%. So it's a little bit hard going for a while there for them. But it is through their winter months. So really the key is come I know that the borders are open till December at this stage, but if they are brought forward, that would be beneficial to them in terms of leading into the summer period, which is so key for them.
Yeah, and you're probably not seeing a great deal in Victoria.
No, literally it's flatlining, sort of hovering around that 20% mark in the regions, and the capital doesn't look too bad in Melbourne, but that's a bit of a kind of misnomer in the sense that all of that demand is related to, defence forces who have come to Melbourne to help, keep control over various different things. So, yeah.
We got, so we're fingers crossed. I know we're supposed to wait on Daniel Andrews' announcements for mid-September. What does that look like? But fingers crossed we can get back to some normality of corporate travel and get some of those projects back to sustain some or grow some demand.
Yeah, I think for Melbourne, there's with all the infrastructure project work, there is going to be a point where people need to be travelling in to access and be involved in that. The other longer term thing for Melbourne and Victoria more generally is, it's so successfully driven on event related demands that if you're not going to have mass gatherings of any great level, that's going to be quite limiting in terms of what Melbourne previously had. And similar to Adelaide, it's got one of the strongest pipelines, particularly at the top end of luxury and upper upscale properties to come, which are all under construction. So they will arrive. And obviously in lieu of not having, international travel, which they would largely attract and meeting business at the convention centre, if that has to continue to push out, then that will slow down the recovery, unfortunately, in Melbourne.
Yeah, yeah. Then further north to Sydney and the suburbs.
Yeah, so Sydney itself is quite subdued as well. Very, it's probably outside of Melbourne the flattest occupancy line on a daily basis. We aren't seeing as many peaks as we are seeing in the other capitals. In other words, people in Sydney are not choosing to stay in Sydney on a Saturday night. They're getting out to the regions where we are seeing, places in Sydney surrounding doing quite well. We are seeing pockets in the surrounding area of Sydney, in Western Sydney, etc., getting some business. But again, I think some of that might be tied to the various things that are going on with containing the virus, but also the activity that does need to come on, because we effectively have two big cities in Sydney for that as well.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it
The
is
team.
is limited. I think the more Sydney is a great example of that. When you've got a huge populace that can travel through their own state, 2 to 3 hour drive, you're seeing the upside of that. But at the same time, the further you get out, the less that is so.
Yeah, it seems to be that 1, 2, maybe 3 hour drive from the city centre.
Absolutely. Yeah.
We've seen that down with the teams down at Wollongong, Nowra, Dubbo. Dubbo have done a fantastic job in the last few months with very high occupancy levels and growing that rate, and even north up to northern beaches. So yeah, we just hope it's flattened out a little bit recently, but we hope, I suppose, coming into school
Yeah, I think the
holidays, that'll
school
pick up.
holidays is really where that bounces, and you could see the 2 week window through the New South Wales school holidays. That's really then, and what it shows is it's kind of normalised to where it was before the school holiday period. So it hasn't. It would look like it's dropped down, but it actually hasn't when you relate it back to preschool holiday periods.
Yeah, yeah.
I'd expect to see our forward data is indicating the areas around Hunter, Wollongong, Newcastle school holiday period is much stronger in terms of their occupancy than what Sydney is by some margin.
It's a good point. Forward planning, whilst we know we can travel within the state, but come Christmas holidays, do you think we'll be allowed to cross borders, or what does that look like?
Your guess is as good as mine. I think. Look, I think the one position I don't envy at the moment is being a political leader, because I don't think there's no decision is probably the right decision for everyone, but they've got to make the best decision on there. But clearly, the more open and the freedom of movement for everyone, the better outcome that is for confidence, and in turn, us to be staying in hotel rooms.
Yeah, yeah. And climbing into Queensland, Gold Coast, and working our way up.
Yeah, so Gold Coast is, again, school holidays, weekends doing incredibly well, and the same can be said for Sunshine Coast. It's a very similar sort of pattern. Obviously, the news of schoolies the activities around schoolies being cancelled in November will have an impact in that kind of Christmas period. That's always been helpful for that market. It's trending along okay relative to where it was at the height of no movement of travel. It was very difficult. You had single digit occupancies, and a lot of Gold Coast is a large market, and unlike other parts of Australia, because you had a lot of management rights buildings, they never closed because they needed to keep operating to service their full-time tenants. So we didn't see any kind of substantial change in the inventory where you might have, given the fact that you couldn't go and stay on the Gold Coast for that.
Yeah.
And then Brisbane obviously has got the quarantine business as a baseline, but we are seeing some peaks on the Saturday night. So clearly there is activity in terms of social gatherings and that sort of stuff starting to happen. So there's a little bit more reason to have that Saturday night in town related to various different activities. And then some of the business cities, Townsville, Mackay, Gladstone are doing relatively well and almost on par with what they were doing this time last year. Again, for that kind of mining related activity, means that it's quite consistent in the demand that needs to be in those markets. And then obviously North Queensland is able to be attractive to Queenslanders, but and a few people from South Australia, but outside of that, it is quite limiting in terms of the demand they have. And it's doing okay comparatively to some of the other places in Queensland. But when you think this is the best time of the year, and I'm sure Brett, for those in Victoria, with some of the winter weather we've had over the last month, would have been a great advertisement to go and spend a week in 25 degrees and no
No,
humidity.
absolutely. I'd do anything to be at
Yeah,
a few of our sites now up there.
yeah. So I think as the weather starts to change and it gets warmer up there, then the reality of the current restrictions will probably really bear out
Yeah.
the challenges that they're going to have over the next 6 months.
And we took the Matt Burke crystal ball. What does next year look like for us?
Oh, look, I think that's a really difficult question to answer, and it really fundamentally sits around what activity are you and I allowed to do, and that the first thing is getting the confidence, both at an individual level, at a business level, sending their employees around. So I think from a segment perspective, it's really going to be each segment's going to come. The demand driven from each of those segments is probably going to be staggered. You're not going to just see everyone all of a sudden come back. Around the world, what we're seeing is that leisure's come back first, and with the ability to do that, you'll see that, and then hopefully then corporate demand starts to come through for that. But I think those that can capture and understand the key demand that is actually happening in their region can still do reasonably well relative to what's going on in the market. So you need to sort of be on top of those aspects of the business to try and get what you can while it is limited out there.
Well, one of my concerns is certainly low room rates, in particular the city centres that bring a lot of those leisure travellers in instead of heading out. You got some, we've seen some of the big brands, even Quest at Macquarie Park at $90 a night. Some of the bigger inbound hotels in the Gold Coast that would predominantly be $200 a night, selling for 99. So we hope.
I think we're going to get great variability in the average rate. I think the rates over the last couple of weekends in Gold Coast and Sunshine Coast on Friday and Saturday nights are actually up compared to the same Friday, Saturday the year prior. But during the week, they're down, almost 10%. So I think we're going to see great variability. And I think the key is that the pricing is more related to the ability, where demand is coming relative to just kind of the seasons we previously kind of operated under. So it's going to require a little bit more sort of nimbleness. And I think, clearly people are reacting to trying to stimulate that. In parts that might work, in other parts, data doesn't bear out that that's going to drive any additional demand because simply, people can't travel.
It's fantastic, Matt. Really appreciate your time. I can't wait until at some stage borders are open. I can shout you a bit at Ramsgate and show you the rooms that we hopefully open up above there by Christmas this year. Fingers crossed.
I look forward to it. You've created some really cool rooms in Adelaide recently. So look forward to having that beer and you getting out of the house a little bit more often. And Victoria's in a much better place with COVID-19.
Thanks, mate. Appreciate it.
Thanks for everyone's support.